Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video today we're going to talk about 3 different ways you can create a misty effect with watercolor. And then we're going to take all 3 of those ways, put them together, and paint this misty watercolor landscape. I'm using a pad of Baohong cold press watercolor paper. The pad is glued down along the edges, which we're going to need because we're using a lot of water. If you don't have a pad like this, you can tape down the edges of your paper. And then I'm using my limited palette, but we're only going to be using indigo and sap green from my limited colors. Alright, so let's talk about the 3 techniques to create mist. The first one is wet on wet. Now, wet on wet technique is when we are wetting the paper in some way, either with clean water or a light wash of color, and then we are dropping another color into that initial wash that we put on the paper. So I have put clean water onto the paper and I am mixing a tree color using indigo and sap green to drop into that initial clean water on my paper. Now you can see where the paint is actually coming in contact with the water on the paper. It is blooming and bleeding out. So the paint is following where the wetness is. And you can see above that are the hard lines where I have not wetted the paper. And so you get this really nice blooming effect. And it's really subtle and gradual, which can look very misty where the white paper is left more clean. It will look like that misty white fog. Something I want to emphasize is that each of these techniques has their own pros and cons. So one of the pros is the very natural look of the mist. You can see how misty that looks right through those trees. The con is that if you are wetting the entire paper to get that look, there are no harsh lines that you're able to create. So here I'm going back through after it has dried and adding some more of those details to the trees so that not every tree has a misty look. So really we're going to need all 3 of these techniques to paint our final misty landscape. So let's go to technique number 2, which is softening the edge. So this is a common watercolor technique when you paint a very harsh line. So we're painting the trees first. And we're painting it like we normally would with a decent amount of wash. And then we're going to soften the line. We're going to create that misty flow, kind of like how we had in the first example, but we are adding the water after. So now I've cleaned my brush and I'm adding clean water under the trees to pull the pigment down into a watery wash. One of the pros of this technique is that it's a little bit easier to control. You're putting the harsh lines where you want, and then you are deciding how much you want to soften, where you want to soften. But it's a little bit harder to control how the water is flowing, whereas in the first example it stayed pretty close to where the pigment dropped in, and we were able to leave a lot of white space that created the mist. Whereas here we're moving a lot of it around. We're trying to take some out to bring back some of the white space, but you can see that there's just too much color and it doesn't quite give that misty effect. So even though this isn't exactly what we're looking for, we're still going to need this technique when we are painting our misty landscape. That brings us to technique number 3, which is the paper towel dab. You can use a rag. I love paper towel because it gives an uneven texture, which reminds me of mist, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So it's going to start the same way as technique number 2, where we are painting the tree just like we normally would, and we are adding water to create that soft line. But instead of getting frustrated that there's too much color, we're going to take our paper towel, and mine's very messy, but that's okay, it's all dry, and I'm going to dab some of that color off. Now, I love, love, love this technique because you can dab and soften all kinds of areas on the tree and remove some of that color that was frustrating for us in technique number 2. I love that we are able to control where we are creating the soft lines with this technique, but we are able to get more of a gradual blend like in technique number 1. But I love that it gives a jagged texture in some areas that reminds me so much of how mist moves through trees. Now, even though those are the 3 techniques for creating a misty look, we actually need to add them together. Not one single one of these is perfect for creating an entire landscape. So I'm going to show you next how to use all 3 of these to create that misty landscape look that we want for a full piece. To start, we are going to be using the wet on wet technique. So we're going to put our round brushes away for painting the trees later, but we do need to use some type of wash brush to paint the entirety of our paper with clean water. We want the paper to be completely wet and glistening when you look at it from the side, but not dripping, not a lot of puddles, just wet enough that the paint will be able to flow freely. We need a first layer of very misty gray background trees. So I just kind of mushed together all of the paints that I had on my palette to create a greenish gray, really light wash of color, and I'm just dabbing that in kind of this line shape with my wash brush because it kind of resembles tree shapes, because we don't want this to be very specific. It's far away, it's misty, and remember, everything is going to dry so much lighter than this initial color we're putting down. So we just want to get some kind of very faint background trees going on in the distance. I did add a little bit of indigo to the wash to have some contrast between some green and some blue, and also make sure you have enough water in your mixture that it bleeds and blends and gives us that gradual bloom that we're looking for. Now we want to start creating a misty look. So we've got a misty look in the back of these trees, but now around the edge where we don't want even a hard blooming line, we can use the paper towel dab technique to take some of that away and give a nice kind of irregular misty look underneath this kind of background grouping of trees. But we still want more of the wet on wet technique now that we've got those background trees done. So because we took some of that wetness away with the paper towel, we just add some of it back on top. Anytime your paper dries, you can always add clean water on top to bring back that blooming effect that you need. So now we're just going to dab in some greens and some blues in kind of angular shapes. I'm thinking about trees on mountains that would be, going down at different angles, coming from the right and coming from the left. You want maybe some peeking out in the middle of the mist, so you don't want to completely forget the center. And then around the edges of the painting towards the bottom is where we're going to have our darkest amount of paint and our biggest area of trees. And so you can kind of see me forming those shapes, forming those colors, and I really just want to focus on blocking some of that color in while leaving some of the white space while everything is still wet. We really want to focus on that gradual blooming from the wet on wet technique. And it's so interesting because at this point you can kind of see the mist take shape and it looks like it's perfect. But that light color I had as the base is going to dry so much lighter. So in some of these areas where I have this really light mist, I'm adding darkness to the center. So it will look like, a peak of trees that we're seeing, and then it gets more gradual with color into the white. So we do want our lighter values, medium values, and dark values within this misty wet on wet technique as well. So you can see how those lighter values have already started to dry, but we can see the mist and the formation of it, and I'm really liking how it looks, So now we get to start picking up our round brushes and creating more intense shapes of trees and darkness, really increasing the contrast. Because one thing I really want you to remember is that the lightness of the mist only looks significant if you have an appropriate level of contrast from the trees. So light and dark need to both appear for them both to look significant. As the paper begins to dry, we can make the harder lines for the actual tree shapes, like technique 2 and 3, where we can put down the color without any blooming effect, and then we can use water and a paper towel to continue that misty look. When forming trees, I find it easier to paint the middle line of a tree and then create the branches coming off on either side. Remember that as trees are farther away, they're going to be less detailed and a lot lighter, especially in this misty scene. And also, as you get to the base of the tree, you don't have to show as much white space. It's going to be a lot thicker because the trees are going to be denser and more packed together. So save some of that white space and the texture and the wispiness of the tree for the upper parts of the tree, and then you'll have a really nice, realistic look to your tree lines. I switched to a long, round size 4 brush because I feel like a smaller brush with longer bristles actually gives me a more organic, wispy tree texture. Instead of the bigger round brushes can end up looking really circular and blobby for tree shapes. So that's my personal preference. Do whatever works best for you when you are painting trees your way. The darker green shapes that I painted when I did the wet on wet technique in the beginning are what I use as the landmarks for where I put the trees. So you can see I'm painting some of these trees that are in the distance, but I'm using the base of where I had that wet on wet green to make the tree line. So that's where some of the trees are popping out of the mist. So that's where you're going to make sure you have that tree texture. So as I go through this landscape painting, you'll see me apply all 3 of the different techniques. The first technique we talked about, wet on wet, I mostly used at the beginning of the landscape. But then I'm going to apply technique 2 and 3 in different ways throughout the landscape. So I'll paint trees and I want them to blend in with those wet on wet blobs. So I will use clean water to smooth it out. I will use paper towel to dab it just to take some of that color away. Anything to get the trees to blend in with those wet on wet blobs so that we can have both. We need the contrast and the texture of the trees, but we need that gradual soft mistiness that the wet on wet in the beginning gave us. Now we're going to start applying a lot more color and contrast to the trees up in the front of the painting. So I'm getting a lot of the indigo and the sap green so that I have a pretty thick and heavy pigment to water ratio. So we're going to apply this pretty liberally down here at the bottom, and I don't necessarily need a lot of texture or white space within the entire section of this tree line, but I want to bring the texture up towards the top and into the mist. I talked about this earlier on in the video, But something that makes these misty landscapes look very dramatic and realistic is when you have a very dark silhouette of a tree that is against the mist. So I love having these tall, dark trees that are very textured because they're in the front. We're seeing a lot of detail, and they are going up above that wet on wet section that we had painted, so that the tips of the textured areas, the top of the trees, are actually in the misty section. So we're getting a nice contrast between the trees that are in front of the mist and then the mist behind. And that creates a very realistic looking mist. So anytime you're able to do that and have that distinct contrast, your landscape painting will look much better. I'm also taking a lot more time on defining the branches of the trees on this front tree line because they are going to be more detailed because they're closer to us. Painting a landscape like this is very repetitive. It is the same steps over and over again. So I want to let you just watch and observe how I use the 3 techniques that we talked about at the beginning of the video in each section of the landscape. I'll pop in every now and then if I feel like there is something more to add, but pretty much everything is the same and very repetitive from here on out. I want to point out that when you're painting a tree line, it looks visually appealing to have differing heights. So if everything is too equal or too level, it looks like you tried too hard to make it perfect. So I noticed that this left side was looking a little bit too even, and so I started bringing some of those trees taller up into the mist, and it just looks so much better. So no matter where you're painting it, not even just on that forward facing tree line, but anywhere on your landscape, having trees grouped together, closer together, having some farther spaced apart, but also having some short, some tall, some thicker, some more sparse, any way that you can kind of switch up the way each of the trees look, because in real life they're not going to look exactly the same. It'll make it all look that much more visually appealing. I've tried to focus the majority of the harsh lines for the trees towards the top of those colorful blobs that I painted when we did the wet on wet. But I am going to add in some very light texture into the rest of those colored areas, because as the mist is very saturated in the very white areas, it's going to disperse a little bit more through the trees before we get to the very distinct trees that are clear of mist. And so you can add a little bit of texture that isn't necessarily a tree, but gives us the idea that there might be something under there, but there is some light mist that is kind of taking over that area. Thank you so much for being here with me while we painted this misty watercolor landscape. We learned so much about the different ways that you can create mist with watercolor, but then also how to apply all three to create something beautiful and magical. I hope you enjoyed this process and that you can take these tips into your own painting practice, and I will see you all next time. Bye.